Have you ever picked up your guitar, gone and sat down to play, and then had absolutely no idea of what to play? Well, I have. And so I decided that I was basically going to come up with a few go-to chord progressions that I could play when I was in a bit of a rut. So today we're going to uncover 4 of those chord progressions that sound awesome for an alternative grunge style of playing. And I think this can help you whether you're a beginner or you've been playing for a while and you just want some new inspiration. But anyway, let's get tuned up and started. Okay, so for today's video, we're going to be using my Fender Jaguar and we're actually tuned to drop D. If you've watched any of the other videos on this channel, you'll probably know that I love drop D, probably because I'm a lazy guitarist and it means that power chords are just 10 times easier. Now, obviously you don't need to be following the exact key and intervals that I'm playing, but basically you can move these chords anywhere around the fretboard and in any key you like. I think one of the things that's interesting with alternative rock is a lot of the time the chord progressions that you're hearing are basically pop songs. They're just covered up in cool guitar sounds. Now, I'm not sure if we even need to go through this, but I think we will before we get started. There's obviously 7 chords in a key, and in the key of D, that's D, E minor, F sharp minor, G, A, B minor, C sharp diminished, and then back to the D. Now I know obviously I'm only playing the top 3 strings, so you've got the 1st, the 5th, and the major or minor 3rd in each chord. But I mean, generally that's how I play most of the time anyway, and I think it actually lends itself to this kind of music. Now we've got that out of the way, we can look at our first chord progression on this list. And it's actually going to be super simple. It's 2 chords, and it's basically going to be chord 1 and chord 4. So, in the key of D, chord 1 is obviously going to be D major. And then chord 4 is going to be G major. And then back to the D major. Now I've got to be honest, before making this video, I didn't know the exact term for this, and it was only when researching it that I found it. But anyway, basically when you go from chord 5 to 1, that's what's called a perfect cadence, and it sounds like this. It's like super resolving, because the 5th chord adds like tension, and then when you go back to the 1 it just sounds awesome. But when you go from the 4 to the 1, that's not a perfect cadence, it's known as a plagal cadence, or I read its other name is an amen cadence, because it's heard a lot in hymns and stuff, and I can really hear that, like the way it sounds going from to, I don't know, just something about it, I do understand that. Weirdly, even though this is only 2 chords, I actually think it's one of my favourites of all time. Just those 2 chords, I think creates like this train-like feeling of movement. I think if you listen to some of the old Velvet Underground tracks, and then Lou Reed actually used it in his solo stuff with Walk on the Wild Side as well, you just hear that alternating between the 1 and the 4, and it feels like it is resolving but then unresolving again, and it just sounds so cool. And you hear this being used extensively again in another one of my favourite tracks, All My Friends by LCD Sound System. It just basically just does that for the whole song, and I think it just sounds absolutely awesome. I know it's not a guitar that's doing it, but it just sounds great. But they all do have a lot in common. The songs just feel like trains that keep on moving, and it's almost like these chords create like a bed for other melodies and stuff to sit over the top of. I'll just play them as a little sequence here and you can probably hear what I mean. It's seen super clearly in Dinosaur Jr. Feel the Pain. Now I'm sure if you're watching this video you probably also think that that's a ridiculously good track. And that main riff in that song is based around this chord structure. Now obviously that song's in a different key and it's not in D, so I've kind of moved it into D here. I love that song and I think that sounded pretty cool. And that just shows how you can expand this 2 chord progression and make it sound awesome. Moving on to our second chord progression, and that is going to be chord 5 to 3 to 1. So in this key it's going to be A, F sharp minor, and then your D. And now I don't know whether it's maybe to do with that perfect cadence, the 5 to the 1. This feels like you're doing that and your brain wants it to go to the 1, but when you add that 3 in the middle, the minor, I think it just sounds so cool. There's a couple of songs that come to mind when I think of this chord progression. Well, actually, there's one main song, and maybe possibly one of my favourite songs of all time is Mayonnaise by Smashing Pumpkins. It's that descending chord melody that just gets me every time I hear it. I just think when it hits that D at the end, it just sounds so awesome. It's like your brain knows it's going there, and then when it does, it just resolves perfectly. But I think it would be absolutely criminal to play this kind of chord progression and not hear it super fuzzy like in Mayonnaise when that fuzz just kicks in and blows your mind. So I made my own little rendition. Obviously, again, it's not in the same key and it's not quite right, but it was pretty fun to make and this is what we got. I genuinely listened to Mayonnaise about 4 times on repeat when I was thinking about making this video. What an absolute tune it is. It doesn't matter how many times I've listened to it, it just absolutely gets me. But I think it's time we move on to our third chord progression on this list. And this might possibly be the most famous chord progression of all time. Do you remember that thing Axis of Awesome where they played like 50 different songs all with the exact same chords? Well, that's what we're going to look at now. Now, remember at the beginning when I said a lot of this music, like alternative, grungy, I mean, even some of the shoegaze stuff, is actually based around like poppy chords, and then it's just kind of covered up with like awesome sounds and stuff. So these chords are used in a lot of the alt kind of records. And this chord progression basically follows the 1, 5, 6, 4. So again, what you get in the key of D is D major, A major, B minor, G major. A lot of songs will use this chord progression and it will just repeat over a long period of time. And it's because the first chord, obviously the D, the root chord of the key, then goes to the 5th chord, then goes to chord 5, which creates tension. And then that kind of gets resolved a little bit with the minor chord 6, but then you create the tension again by going back to chord 4. So then it just feels like it needs to go back to that first chord again, but then the cycle just kind of repeats. And that's why songs can just repeat that over and over again and it won't ever feel like it's getting tired. It'll just make your ears feel like they want to go to the next chord continuously. A really good example of that is U2 With or Without You. It's basically just those chords the whole way through. And again, it just allows that like bed of melodies to sit on top of it. Under the Bridge actually does a similar sort of thing. I think there might be some other chords there, and obviously John Frusciante is like picking stuff and making melodies within the guitar. I mean, that guitar work's just like ridiculously good in that song, but that's based around those same chords repeating. Actually, the way I like using these chords the most, and again, it might be specific to me because I'm a lot of the time writing guitar parts that are going to have vocals on top of it. But if I ever need like a big explosive chorus from like a verse part or something, I'll often go to these chords because you can just find so many vocal melodies over the top. So what I've done here is I've basically just done it as power chords and I've sped it up just to show you how that actually sounds. Okay, I think that probably leads us on to our 4th and final chord progression. And this is a bit of a segue on from the last one because this is actually very similar. It's basically the relative minor version of that chord progression. And so it starts on chord 6, then chord 4, then chord 1, and then chord 5. So obviously if you cut it in half and start it from the 3rd chord of that pattern, it's basically the same sequence. But it does give a different tonality to it. Again, the tension and release that you get from this chord progression basically allows you to just keep looping it on and keep looping it. The first chord, chord 6, is like restful. Then you go to chord 4, which adds that little bit of tension again, and then back to chord 1, which feels like it's resolving, but then you go to chord 5, which is again super tense, so then it feels like it needs to all just happen again. Here in the key of D, we're going to have our relative minor chord 6, which is going to be a B minor, and then we're going down to chord 4, which is the G major, and then we're going down to the D, chord 1, and then back up to chord 5, which is going to be an A major, and then back to the minor again. Now obviously with the first chord progression on our list, we spoke a little bit about how J Mascis picked out the chords and how that really added to it. And particularly with this chord pattern, because it sounds a little bit sadder, I love to play it slow and pick the chords out in different keys. So this is what I've done here. I've added a little bit of effects and stuff, and then I added a little drone to go along with it, and I think it sounds pretty cool. I think in actual fact, I actually prefer that chord progression to the other one, the other major one, just because I think it sounds a little bit sadder and it sounds really cool. But hopefully this has helped you either learn some new chord progressions or give you a little bit more inspiration if you've been a bit stuck. And hopefully my haphazard music theory hasn't been too awful, and I've actually showed you why these chord progressions work, and why some of your favourite bands probably just keep using them. And a good tip would be to start playing these chords and then maybe either pick into them or add extra passing notes to mix them up and stuff. But anyway, if you've enjoyed this, let me know what your favourite chord progression is down in the comments, and then watch this video here next.